Thank you everyone for joining us today on this webinar. We will begin momentarily. Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I am excited to be here today. My name is Esther D'Souza, and I'm the product marketer for BIM 360 Design. I will be facilitating today's webinar with our presenters here today. I'm very excited for the topic for this webinar. So we have our customer spotlight with Stantec. We have Robert Manna, who is joining us today. He is an associate with Stantec's building design practice, and he will be interviewed in a Q&A session with Adam Peter, who is our customer success engineer here at Autodesk. Here is a quick look at our agenda, just so that you know what we're gearing up to look at today. We're going to jump right into the live Q&A with Robert and talk a little bit with him about, his challenges and the team challenges in Revit collaboration, his experience with other collaboration solutions out there, and then of course BIM 360 Design and some of his best practices and power user tips, which I think were really fascinating and fun to sort of create that content with him here for today's webinar. And then we're going to cover some adoption numbers for BIM 360 Design, so you can really see how this product is being used. And then at the end, we're going to get into the Q&A session. And over here, I'm going to remind you that in the handout section of your console, there is a resources handout that I'd encourage you to download and save. It has the information that you need to get successfully started with BIM 360 Design. A lot of handy tips, links. I'd suggest you download that now and save it. And also a reminder to use the questions panel to type in your questions to those of us here on the call who are supporting Q&A on the back end for you today. And I just want to quickly introduce both Robert and Adam on today's webinar. So Robert here, he is a member of Stantec's Buildings Digital Practice team and is a leader in the implementation and support of new processes and technology throughout the organization. He was trained originally as an architect with a degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and his key responsibilities currently include, but are not limited to, being the product owner for Stantec's model database and Stantec's suite of custom Revit tools, the management of the migration and integration of design technology for their individual acquisitions, of course, interactions with technology vendors. He liaises with IT for configuration and deployment of software and technology, and of course, keeping pace with various technology trends. He also serves as the chairman of the Design Technology Summit, which is an annual meeting of design technology leaders from the largest architecture and engineering firms in North America. And when he has the time, he enjoys skiing in the East Coast and in the Rockies, and does a one sprint triathlon a year, and still finds time for his family, his 2 children and wife. And Adam Peter, joining us here today, as I said, is a customer success engineer. He supports BIM 360 design, including both its legacy workflows in BIM 360 team and next-gen workflows in the platform, many of which we'll be covering today. He has served in various roles for the last 8 years with Autodesk. He's at the forefront of customer usage and supports architecture and engineering teams in their setup, configuration, and best practices of BIM 360 design. In his unique position, he has the ability to bring customer feedback from his experiences to shape the future of Autodesk solutions for projectability and collaboration. So I'm really excited to have both Adam and Robert present on this webinar today. But before we get started, I want to take a couple temperature check polls, as I like to call them here. So if you have a moment, please follow the instructions on the polling board that should load for you now. I'd just like to understand if you currently use Revit or the AEC collection. Okay, I'm going to close this poll out. And one more quick poll. I'd like to understand what industry you are in and where you're joining us from today. So please give us a couple seconds as it loads. Maybe you're joining us from an architecture firm or a structural engineering firm, or maybe MEP. Maybe you're a contractor, a GC. Welcome. I see the ticker go up for other. So if you are inclined, feel free to drop in a note about what other industry you're joining us from today, so we can have that context. All right, fantastic. And I'm gonna close that poll. I'll share the results of this one with you, just so you know who you're sharing today's webinar call with. It looks like primarily design firms joining us here on all 3 fronts, and then of course construction and some from other industries. Fantastic. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam and Robert to kick it off. Oh, I'm sorry. This slide was supposed to show up with when I was introducing Adam and Robert, but yes, this is Robert on the left and Adam on the right. All
Thank you,
right,
Esther.
the floor is all yours.
Thanks. And at least now that people have a face to go with the name. So I'm Adam. Welcome, everyone. And thank you, Esther, for the kind introductions. Robert, I also want to thank you for joining us today. Esther gave a nice description of who you are and kind of a general overview, but I thought it might be good for us to just start off a little bit more in depth about who you are, how you got to where you are, and like what is it that you kind of do on a day in and out basis for Stantec in relation to Revit and projects and collaboration?
Sure. Thanks, Adam, and hopefully everybody can hear me all right. Yeah, how did I get here? I don't think we have enough time to talk about that in detail, but I started out as a practicing architect working on projects, got involved in Revit very early on in my career, and sort of snowballed from there, I guess. Helped with implementation of Revit at Burt Hill, which was my original firm, and then Burt Hill was acquired by Stantec in 2010, and continued to further involve myself with the implementation and support of technology in practice, which leads me to being part of the digital practice team within Stantec buildings. So Esther, I think there should be some text on the left side there of the slide. Maybe that's another, there we go. Hey, so the digital practice team at Stantec were responsible within the buildings group for helping with the strategic direction, implementation, support of technology. So what does that really mean? we're trying to look after all the technology that's used by our practitioners to get their work done. And specifically, I sort of fall on that infrastructure side of the line these days. So both providing support as well as helping to manage development, and working very closely with the other side of the line in terms of delivery and business. So you could argue I started out in delivery because those are the guys who are really focused on day-to-day stuff in Revit, and now I'm sort of at a higher level in terms of overall support and infrastructure management, and where are we trying to go in the long term. And our vision is that all of that working together, we drive innovation collectively in our practice in terms of the use and application of technology. So I think maybe that's a good summary. I guess, what do I do on a day-to-day basis? Specifically with Revit, I have a really big focus on the collaboration tools. I've been involved with collaboration tools with Revit for quite some time. So that's why I'm here, I think, maybe. Been very involved in that, and then also custom tools within our Revit ecosystem, and also working very closely with the Autodesk teams in terms of conveying our desires, sometimes our issues and problems, but working very closely with all the groups to move things forward. So.
Excellent. Thanks for that context. I thought it'd be good for us to also get a better understanding just from the Stantec perspective and what you've been working on. Obviously, you guys are doing a lot in Revit, and so we wanted to find out a little bit more about like what motivates you to find a good collaboration solution for Revit. Like maybe talk a little bit about the history of that process and where your needs kind of arose from in that regard.
Yeah, sure. And again, I think we've got a little bit of text to pull up, Esther, on the slide there. So again, I started way back in 2003 with Burt Hill. We had 6 offices in the greater Northeast of the U.S. at that time. And even in that day and age, as we were adopting Revit in the mid-aughts, we needed to be able to collaborate between those 6 offices. So starting as early as 2006, 2007, we were saying, well, how do we collaborate between multiple geographic locations in Revit, knowing that there were, in particular, some pretty major issues with trying to use Revit models across a wide area network way back then. And that was back in the day where having a T1 was a really big deal in terms of connectivity to the internet. So been dealing with that. And then, of course, Burt Hill was acquired by Stantec, which increased our footprint to a much more significant area within North America. And this is admittedly just a map of North America in terms of our locations in North America, but Stantec is a global company, a growing global company. We've recently announced a couple of acquisitions in other countries and other parts of the world. And so that's just further increasing our footprint. We've got about 4,000 employees who are dedicated to delivering building design and engineering services, as opposed to our 18,000 close friends across the rest of the company. So we want to be able to share work. We want to be able to share work both because we want to be able to bring the right expertise to bear on particular projects, and we want to share work to help balance the workload across the organization so that we don't run into issues of overstaffing in one location and being understaffed in other locations. So fundamentally, trying to solve this issue for a number of years now. We've looked at a lot of different solutions over the years, and for a variety of reasons, continue to focus on the Autodesk provided solutions. But I can remember back in the day, we looked at another vendor's technology that can be used with Revit models to share those Revit models, and it's in use even still to this day. And I accused the vendor of tricking Revit. They didn't like that when I told them that, but it seemed a little bit flawed in terms of its approach, particularly knowing a little bit about how Revit worked in the background. And so, it works for some people in certain circumstances, but it wasn't going to work for us with large teams spread across multiple locations across North America and now the globe. And then we've also looked at other solutions that are more on the infrastructure side. There's a number of different vendors that are in business today and vendors that existed previously that, again, trying them out, testing them out, putting them through their paces, we were never really satisfied with the results, and there were always concerns about, well, fundamentally what's going on in the background and how is this actually working, knowing, again, a little bit about how Revit models work in the background, particularly when you're dealing with work sharing and whatnot. So that's, we've explored lots of opportunities. Trying to dead files across such a large organization is problematic. We want things to be up to date with as little friction as possible. So, sharing stuff through FTP or even copying files from file server to file server just imposes a lot of restrictions and issues there in terms of the workflow. And then fundamentally, again, going back to the idea that we want to be able to deliver projects from all of our offices, we also want to be able to present Stantec as a global design firm where you're going to get services. If you go to any one of our offices, you can count on consistent services from all of our offices, and that people will be consistently involved, and you're going to get a consistent product from us. We need to be a single 4,000 person AE firm delivering projects, not a bunch of individual offices with the same name that deliver projects in their area. We want to deliver projects for communities around the globe that are meeting those communities' needs, but again, we're acting as one team as much as possible. That's a goal. We strive for it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Robert. That certainly gives us some really good context here, and I think that expanding, footprint is something that a lot of people can relate to. Just being able to recognize that you're one company providing the same services, no matter where that point of entry is for your guys as customers. Which kind of leads me into our next poll. I want to just kind of pause and get a taste or flavor of, again, where our attendees are at in some of this regard as well. And so I have two poll questions here. The first one is just, how do you collaborate today? So Robert talked a little bit about their expanding need to be able to move files around and have people access data and information within a project. So we just kind of wanted to get some context for the attendees, and if that's a pain point that you guys can relate to as well by how you happen to collaborate. So I'll just let this run here for a minute. And once it looks like we've got a pretty good percentage of people having voted, we'll move on. Great, it looks like we're getting some good feedback. I'll let it go for just a few more moments. Excellent, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close and share. So it definitely looks like the vast majority of you are using email or some other file sharing app like Dropbox or Google Drive, so appreciate that. And then as we kind of get to the next part of our conversation, which is really going to be focused more around BIM 360 design, we just wanted to also get a pulse of what your level of experience is with BIM 360 design. So if you guys can go ahead and participate in the voting there, we'd appreciate that to give us some context for where our starting point is for our conversation today. Good response, guys. I'll leave it open here for just a few more moments. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and close And again, I'll share out those results. So it looks like we have a good mix of people here. About a third of you have not have any experience with BIM 360 design, and then a good chunk, about half of you, have at least seen it or are trying to use it, at least on some introductory stuff. So really glad for that input and appreciate it. Esther, if you could advance this a slide. This next one is going to be kind of interesting, and Robert, I want to get some feedback from you here. On this slide, we're just kind of looking at the overall evolution of work sharing with Revit and kind of where we came from to where we're at now. And I'm sure you're certainly on this spectrum somewhere. So maybe you could just talk for a few minutes about how long you've been using BIM 360 Design. Obviously, that was just launched this past April. I'm sure you've been using Revit Cloud Work Sharing. I know you have been using that for some time as well. So maybe just talk about your guys' history along this timeline and what that journey's been like for you guys a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sets a good stage for the following conversation around 360 design in general. So, you know, it was kind of funny when Adam and I were getting prepped for this conversation today. And he's like, yeah, I want to ask you about how long have you been using 360 design? I'm like, Adam, you guys just launched it. I think, though, that said, Stantec can actually claim to be one of the longest users of BIM 360 design, along with a handful of other organizations out there in the world, because we were fortunate enough to be involved in early, or maybe late, I guess late is the better description, late beta testing of 360 design before it was actually launched in the public market. So I can actually say that we've probably been using it almost as long as you possibly could in production. And the reason why we were comfortable with taking what some might see as a pretty significant risk is we've been using Revit Cloud Work Sharing, formerly known as Teams, right, or C4R. We've been using that quite a bit since it launched, because we also were one of the longest customers of that platform as well, because again, we had used that platform before its public launch as well on projects. So we've been really involved with this process of this, and that actually takes us back to even Revit Server, where again, we were involved with Revit Server as Burt Hill before its public launch as well. So we have a deep history, fortunately for us, of working with the production teams, the development teams that have developed these services over the years. And for me in particular, when Cloud Work Sharing came out, I looked at it in hindsight and said, well, I'm glad we were a really good test case with Revit Server, right? Because effectively, it's been an evolution from Revit Server to where we are today with 360 Design, and it's generally gotten successfully better as we've gone along, and that's why we keep using these tools within Stantec, because we think they're a great solution for work sharing with Revit models. And you know, work sharing goes all the way back to 2002, but again, there were a lot of fundamental issues there if you wanted to do anything outside of your own office with teams, and we've again progressed further along that timeline in terms of improved services, improved ability to do things and get things done. So I think that's sort of a good review of how we got to where we are.
Yeah, and I can appreciate, you know, those comments. One of the interesting things about this timeline, you know, as I was just reflecting on this, is it speaks to a progression of trying to answer really the specific pain point that you had mentioned when we had that other slide with all your offices, is how do we use Revit in a way that we can share that data and, you know, co-work on the same models at the same time across multiple offices, which you've obviously you know, had to deal with, having offices all over the world now, really. So as we look at that timeline and we see how we went from like regular work sharing to having Revit Server to being able to work in the cloud, maybe just spend a few minutes talking through like what some of those, I mean, obviously each of these steps along the way is serving a specific need and trying to answer a pain point that went with the previous solution, right? So maybe just expand on that. We've got a good, third of our attendees today who really don't have much exposure to BIM 360 design. Maybe just talk about, what was the specific pain point with Revit Server that was answered by the Revit Cloud Work Sharing or collaboration for Revit, and then obviously that was a great solution. However, there were still some pain points that are getting answered with BIM 360 design. So maybe just talk for a few minutes about how that progression looked like for Stantec.
Yep. So, Revit Server fundamentally was designed for internal use for a specific company. And there's at least one solution on the market even today that helps you expand Revit Server to involve multiple companies through a relatively secure VPN connections between those companies. But it's not what Revit Server was designed to do. And even though that vendor has done a good job of making that system relatively secure, for a publicly traded company like Stantec, it just doesn't pass muster with our overall security posture. For smaller companies, it's okay, frankly. For a large company like ourselves, it just isn't. And so, the original collaboration for Revit answered that pain point where we could now have people for multiple companies collaborating on Revit models. But as anybody who's familiar with the product line is aware, in that collaboration for Revit environment, it was as what Autodesk termed a high trust environment. Everybody had access to all the Revit models. You could, if you wanted to, you could edit any Revit model, etc. So it was a high trust environment, and that was fine in a lot of cases. Though we also talked some of our projects out of going in that direction and sticking with the traditional methods of sharing data, whether it be FTP or Nuforma or whatever, because there was going to be concerns about that high trust environment where it just, when we really framed it for the project manager and we said, this is the environment you're going to be in, this is the environment your team's going to be working in, how are you going to manage that with these external folks involved and in that environment with you? It was like, yeah, I guess we aren't going to do that because, again, it's a terrible thing to say, but there were trust issues, right? Or the scope or the contractual mechanisms just weren't well enough defined to be like, if we were all in there, that gets a little shaky. So 360 design helps to deal with those issues, right? Where now we have full control over the security of our models, who has access to what. Ironically, having a low trust environment imposes some other interesting implications on us that we haven't had to deal with before. So, it's very interesting, particularly if you're a consultant being asked to participate in a 360 design project that is controlled by presumably the architect or whoever is managing that site. You're being placed in a somewhat awkward position, but again, we think there's a lot of value there in using those services and that level of control and management, and even within teams that are wholly Stantec. So again, large organization, there's a lot of projects we deliver completely in-house. We still like having that low trust environment, even with internal teams sometimes. And it's not necessarily that we distrust people. It allows for control of the information flow, which is sometimes the more important thing, right? Depending on the type of project you're delivering and the needs of that project, document control and management, who has access to what, when did things change, when did one part of the team receive information from another part of the team. Those can all be really, really important for projects, and BIM 360 design helps deliver those types of features. And again, a way that's friendly with Revit, because I'm not going to stand here and say there aren't other products that don't do that, but they, in our opinion and our experience, don't play as well with Revit in particular as some of those other solutions out there do. So yeah, that's what's really driven us in this direction, and why we've been happy to adopt these services for our projects.
Thanks, Robert. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more in depth about the BIM 360 platform in general. And obviously, you guys are using it for overall data management and collaboration. You talked a little bit about high trust and low touch trust, which I granted are somewhat kind of Autodesk-y terms, but maybe
Adam,
talk about.
Adam, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to clarify, we like to say managed trust, because in no way are we saying this is a low trust environment, because trust is very much high. But we like to say managed because it just manages expectations. Yeah.
Yep. Nope. That's a very valid point. So yeah, when we're talking about what we're really talking about is really a level of permissions that you set per project, right? So certain people have certain access to certain data at any given point in time based on the permissions that the administrator of that project is able to distribute, to the rest of the stakeholders in the project. So it's a good clarification, and we appreciate that. So Robert, maybe you could spend a few minutes here just talking about, do you have maybe some examples of how using BIM 360 in general, or the design collaboration module, has changed the way that your team does do collaboration when it comes to Revit?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know that it's changed the way we collaborate as much as making collaboration more effective is maybe a better way to phrase it. So I grabbed this image from the project that we've had in 360 the longest at this point. And I think what's really cool about this image from my perspective is you can see how the different parts of the team, in this case the different disciplines, are actively sharing their updates with each other. And I'm not aware of a platform that necessarily provides this kind of graphic view of what's going on and what's been going on and where are we. And you can see the cadence of the sharing of data between the teams, right? This team has clearly agreed that on a fairly regular schedule, they're going to exchange data between each other in order to keep each other up to date. And sometimes there's obviously places where there were multiple shares, probably because there was a deadline. So for those who aren't terribly familiar with 360 design and design collaboration, what you're seeing is a timeline of all the times that Revit models have been shared with other parts of the teams. So architecture sharing with engineers, engineers share with architects. So each little dot represents a moment in time where work was shared. And those little numerals on the dots basically indicate there were multiple times that the stuff was, and the timeline is just set at a scale that those individual dots can't be rendered, right? So you're looking at 10 months of time here. And so this is all, if we were doing this in a traditional mechanism, because we're dealing with, in particular here, we're dealing with external consultants. All the engineering is out of house from Stantec. Stantec's delivering the architecture and the landscape. We would have had to be exchanging all of these files through most likely Nuforma in our case. And so that would have meant somebody, somebody within Stantec would have had to cut copies of the architecture models, drop them into a Nuforma folder, create the Nuforma transmittal, or maybe auto creates for you. That would have to get distributed out to all of your partners. Your partners would then have to download all those models, and then they'd have to set them up in their environment and reload them into Revit models and blah, 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 blah. That's all gone, right? So the moment somebody from the team shares that package, and then the moment somebody from another team consumes that package, the data is there. Is it instantaneous? No, but it's a heck of a lot faster than the traditional upload, download, copy and move files around, blah, 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 blah. So again, particularly dealing with externals, this is a huge advancement for us because it means our users are not spending time, a billable time, on moving files around, and with some luck, they're spending billable time doing more useful tasks on the project as opposed to I'm going to upload files now or download files or whatever. So we think this is huge. We think it's important. Our teams like the ideas of this. The other thing that our teams are now starting to delve into a little bit more, you know, for the first team out of the gate, it was like enough to like figure out how we're going to share stuff. But now our other successive teams are starting to look more at some of the additional features that design collaboration provides, in particular the change visualization component of it, right? So understanding as an architect, I'm going to consume this updated model from my structural engineer, being able to understand, well, what did that structural engineer actually change in their model since the last time I consumed that? There's a lot of potential upside there. There's a lot of potential value there in terms of being able to interrogate these models that are coming from other parts of the team before we go ahead and consume them, and being able to just say, nope, I don't even want it, right? That's the other thing that I talk about internally with our teams is, you know, if you're coming up on a deadline, mechanical engineer is trying to get their work done, and you know, architects were famous for changing things up until the last minute, right? Well, the reality is that for the mechanical engineer to meet that deadline, maybe they don't need those changes that the architects have made, the most recent changes. You know, whatever they've got for their architecture background is sufficient for what they need to produce for their deadline. And again, in the traditional or the previous generation of collaboration for Revit, and even in Revit Server, if those things were live linked, that those engineers had to eat those changes right then and there, right? If it was a live link across disciplines, you were living with it, and if a change from the architect totally screwed up your drawings at the 11th hour, as an engineer, you had to deal with it, and you had to fix it before you could produce your drawings. Now, this offers that level of control and puts that decision making in the engineer's hands or whoever's hands to say, nope, I don't want those changes from the architect yet. I'm happy with where I'm at. I understand the ramifications of that decision, and I'm going to proceed forward. And so, you know, alternately, you can say, yeah, I'm going to take those changes. I'm going to deal with it because I have to, because again, I understand the ramifications of my decision in going down that path. And so, again, this provides that level of control that, yeah, we have that in a dead drop environment, but we don't really like dead drop environments, right? It imposes a lot of overhead on our project teams. And so now we sort of have that combination of both the quote unquote live linking or seamless data transfer, while also having those respected boundaries between the different parts of the team. In fact, you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but you'll note that there's a couple other Stantecs on this image. And there was a part of the Stantec team where we said, you know, we're going to let you view the models and potentially link the architectural models into your own models, but you don't get to edit the primary architectural models. And again, there were reasons for that decision, and this allows us to do it. You also note that there's civil is listed up there at the top. Needless to say, civil's not working in Revit, but we actually made them a team because they were willing to potentially download the Revit files. And so they ended up being a team, even though there's not really a lot of crossover there yet between civil and design collaboration. So we're definitely trying to push the boundaries of what we can do with the services and the products, and trying to adapt it to our team's needs, you know, from a, you know, you can do live linking if you need to, or we can divvy it up however we see fit to meet the needs of the projects.
Absolutely. And that's right. I appreciate that. And, you know, Robert, I think it's an interesting observation as well. You know, you mentioned no engineer wants to just be a file manager when it comes time to being able to share the stuff that they have. But one of the interesting things about this is that because you can select a specific model that is a specific version that you want to share out with other people on the project, but it's all staying within the context of, you know, this project environment. So you're not taking a copy of that, putting that file out somewhere where now you're just trying to manage copies on different platforms that you're trying to share with. I think it's interesting about this solution is that it's all staying within the context of the project, so people can see who's sharing what and when in context with everything else that's happening. So,
yep.
Just
yeah, and I guess another note or little vignette too is we've got another project that's in the environment now. I think they have over 100 individual Revit models for the project. There's, I want to say, upwards of 30 to 40 buildings as part of that project. Some of the buildings are quite large. A lot of them are not terribly huge. I don't know how they would be managing that in any other environment at this point. Certainly it's been done in the past with lots of models, but you basically also have to have dedicated resources to just manage all those models if you're using traditional systems. And even in the previous generation of collaboration for Revit, it would have been problematic because there are just so many buildings. But they wanted to have everybody in a single environment for that project. And again, you know, could we have done it in other solutions? Yes. Would it have been a hassle and a nightmare? Yes.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to shamelessly plug the fact that Autodesk University is coming up. For those attending, if you haven't registered for it, absolutely think about it and consider it. It's a great event. Robert is teaching a class there. Our next section, and I know our time is going by very quickly, isn't like maybe an abbreviated version, but just when you're thinking about, you know, creating projects in BIM 360 in general, I thought it would be beneficial for us to take a few minutes and just talk about some things that are on Robert's mind when you create a new project or get a team going on a new project, with some maybe tips and tricks and best practices. I'm often asked about best practices and what are other companies doing. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity for you to maybe share some of the things that are top of mind for you as you you know, bring people on board within Stantec and get them up and running on new projects.
Yep, absolutely. So, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Esther, please. So the class itself will be Wednesday at 2:45 at AU. And the name is Advanced Strategies for Managing Your Projects in BIM 360 Design Collaboration. Whew, that's a mouthful. So just remember Wednesday at 2:45 p.m. if you're interested. And so the class is really focused on pushing the boundaries with the tool. The class is not going to teach you the basics of how to set up a straightforward project in 360 necessarily, but how do you start to really do some more advanced stuff with it in terms of what you want to do and share. But as part of that, we came up with some top tips for setting things up and getting things going. Desiree Mackey from Martin Engineers is my co-speaker for that class, so I'll plug her as well. And so anyways, let's just run through this really quickly. What we find is that when you name your projects, so I don't get to name the projects at Stantec. I don't have that level of access. But what we do find as a good practice, especially if you're going to have a lot of projects in this type of environment, project number at the front, and then some sort of nickname, name, or whatever after that, and some sort of maybe delimitation between the two. It makes it really easy if you have a long list to find what you're looking for, right? And I know a lot of companies create folders, structures based on their project numbers, but just in case, being a new environment, stick with that. It works. What I also tell our teams is even if you don't intend to make use of the advanced sharing and document control capabilities in terms of sharing and consuming packages in 360, I tell them to set up a folder structure that you could use if you wanted to go down that path regardless. So 360 does let you do live linking and emulate an environment similar to the previous generation if you want to. But even if you do that, my recommendation would be still create your subfolders that would represent your teams, even if you're not going to employ that functionality, because you don't know if something's going to change down the road. Either Autodesk might release a feature that becomes really compelling to say, no, I do want to do that, or some dynamic about the project or the team might change where you do find it necessary to implement that. And not that you can't go back and change things later, but just set it up from the beginning and it's easier, I promise. Subfolders, again, for these team folder names, I do highly recommend some sort of structured naming convention, similar to what you hopefully are employing internally, if only for consistency to help people moving between your projects. So I've been recommending this sort of numerical designator, then the discipline, the company that's actually working on it. Conversely, again, that large project I spoke of really briefly, you might need to put a building name identifier in front of that, only because if you have multiple buildings and you want to break it up along the individual buildings, you might need to do that as well. So again, these are things that people do internally all the time, but I do also notice that sometimes people forget about these good practices when they move into new environments, or like, oh, it's the cloud, why do we need to worry about that? Well, my recommendation would be keep worrying about it. Move on to the next slide, please. So let's see, what's the next one here? There we go. So right now, when you're dealing with user management, there's not a lot of choices in terms of the actual user management in the admin portion. They do have the roles mechanism, which they recently substantially added to the list of different roles, but you don't have any real control over what that role means per se. There's more options, but you can kind of treat it like a group, but you don't really have direct control over it either. So what we have found, for better or worse, is we've been using the company field to sort of use that as a way to create groups within individual projects, because the company field on an individual user different per project. Even so, I might, on one project, my company might be just Stantec Consulting, and another project, my company might be Stantec Architecture. It's still the same Robert.Manna user account, but because it's individualized per project, it can vary there. And so what we've done is, like, we have Stantec Architecture, Stantec MEP, and again, that then allows us to more granularly apply permissions in terms of access to folders, what team are the users on, and whatnot. And it's a little bit easier to keep track of than trying to remember, well, did I assign everybody in the architecture team to the architecture role or not? I mean, that one's pretty obvious, but some of them aren't as obvious. So, that's a good way to sort of work around some of the current limitations that are there. Add all known members up front. Again, it's just easier, right? Adding users is a bit of a hassle regardless. So if you have a list, just add them all to begin with. And if you don't want them to have access to anything right away for whatever reason, you can add them and just give them no access to anything. So they've been added to the project, but they don't have access to any folders or any content yet. So I do recommend that, just because, again, it's easier. Take care of it as much as possible. You will have to add more people later, but that's the way it goes, right? And then a good thing is that unlike the previous generation environment where anybody could invite anybody, and as soon as you were invited in, if you were working in Revit, you could get to those files. With the BIM 360 environment, somebody has to be invited by a project administrator. They have to accept that invitation, and then they can access the files through Revit, as well as obviously accessing the web console itself. So previously, you could just get invited to go in Revit. Now the users absolutely have to log into that project, particularly if they've never been in BIM 360 before. I believe once you've been in one BIM 360 project, you don't have to do that. But if they've never been in the environment, which is likely going to be the case for a lot of your users to begin with, they absolutely must go and accept that invite and log into the project. And then I think, do I have one more slide of tips? I think so. Yeah. So again, you can emulate the higher trust environment of the previous generation, right? So you can basically give people access to other folders to live link. So if the structural engineers really just want to always see the latest and greatest changes from the architects, you can give the structural engineers view permission on the architecture folder, and they can browse there and link the actual central models that the architect is working on, as opposed to having to go through the share and consume process, or again, there's some variants of that process as well. So again, this is where subfolders can be really helpful, as opposed to having everybody in one pool, because you can give them view access, which sort of comes down to the next one there, where view versus edit is distinctly different here. You can give the structural engineers view access, which means they'll be able to link those architectural models. But if that same structural engineer goes to File Open and they try to browse the architect's folder, which they'll be able to go to the folder, they actually will not see any files to open because they only have view access. So those files are only going to show up in the links dialog in Revit. They're actually not going to show up in the File Open dialog. So another benefit to actually breaking down your folder structure, even if you intend to have live linking, is you can do a few things to prevent unintentional consequences because users do something that they didn't mean to or shouldn't have done, but mistakes happen. So we can help eliminate some of those mistakes by taking some time to think about our project setup. And then the last thing is Desktop Connector has been out. I think it officially launched this spring. Maybe it launched a little bit sooner than that. I sort of lose track. But Desktop Connector is out there, and increasingly our teams are also embracing Desktop Connector to use in conjunction with Revit to link in other content with the 2019.1 update for Revit and the update for Civil 3D. There's now the I don't remember the name of the tool, but allows the civil engineers to publish a topo surface that you can link into Revit from Civil 3D, and that relies on the Desktop Connector application as well. So pay attention to that. Go grab that. It's still relatively new. Still has a ways to go in terms of development, but it's great for what it does even today, and we like it. So we're starting to embrace that and use it some more.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert, and thanks for being with us today. This certainly isn't the end. However, we did want to, I know we're getting near the top of the hour, so Esther, we wanted to turn it back to you to talk about some adoption stuff, and then if we have any time left at the end, we can take some Q&A stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Robert. That was really insightful for me to listen to it, and because of your historical association with how these products have developed. Wow, I learned a lot. But I'm going to turn this over back to the audience and just bring to mind the number one question that you're probably thinking about, which is, can I trust it? They have Robert on here speaking very highly of the value of BIM 360 design, but does it actually work? Will this fit me and meet me at my point of need? And so I just wanted to pull up some numbers to show you just where we are in terms of adoption and usage of the product. So currently, BIM 360 Design is being used in 155 countries across the world and supports over 17,500 active projects with over 150,000 cloud models that teams like yours are collaborating in, and they're in the cloud. And so with every second that ticks by, there's about 3 to 4 Sync to Central changes being committed to the cloud, which totally amounts to about 2 million syncs per month. And on large models, we're seeing that Sync to Central time decrease. Some of you might be used to waiting for minutes, hours for your changes to be committed and saved, but that is being drastically reduced because of that computing power of the cloud. So I just wanted to share some of this color with you all. To help reinforce the fact that this may be a new product in the way it was rebranded and launched, but it's very much something that's being used by other teams like Stantec, other teams unlike Stantec in size, scope, capacity, and is very successful. So I'm going to take a couple questions now from the audience for those of you that have any questions for Robert specifically or the solution overall. But to start off, I only have time for 2 or 3 at most, unfortunately. But to start off, I'm going to pick one that I saw that came in from Kevin Bruno, if you'll just give me a moment. So Kevin asked, Robert and Adam, Kevin asked, as a technology advocate of collaboration, Unity and Revit advances, do you feel that the technology of today specifically to Autodesk or other third-party solutions or Amazon Cloud services, do these surpass your needs, or is technology overall not advancing fast enough to sustain client and industry expectations? I think it's a great question, and I'd love to hear what you think, Robert.
It is a good question. I guess, nothing probably ever advances as fast as we want it to or would like it to. I'm a bit of a pragmatic and realist, though, at the same time, which is that, okay, well, this is what we've got and this is where we are. And can we make it work, and does it help improve the overall process? So I certainly won't stand here and say that I think this is the end-all, be-all of the journey, but it's certainly, particularly looking at timeline of advancements, I think it's certainly been a positive progression. And certainly I have the benefit of, again, having been fairly closely involved with development teams over the years. I also can say that I have an appreciation for what it takes to develop these solutions and ensure that they're relatively robust and are going to work, right? I can remember the early days of both Revit Server and C4R, which at the time was called Skyscraper, where there were a lot of issues, and they solved a lot of those issues before we went to production or before it was released to full production. And so, is it the end? No, but I think I do believe that with where we are, particularly with 360 design, it's a highly competitive solution, especially if you're trying to look down the road. As Esther said at the beginning, I'm always trying to keep an eye on what's going on across the board. So I'm not here to necessarily be an Autodesk cheerleader. I give them a lot of polite way to say this. I give them a lot of tough love in behind the scenes.
That's right, and Adam can attest to that. Thank you. That was insightful. So I'm gonna pick up your question and attempt to answer this along with Adam, but we really want to say, as far as the outages that have happened this month, when it comes to, Revit Cloud work sharing piece, that specific component, we want to reassure our customers who are using it. It is our number one priority to address this. It took place because of a series of unfortunate coincidences, which weren't caused because of changes to the service overall, but just things that happened, unfortunately, back to back. There is a project that's scheduled to start next week that's aimed to make the service more reliable and more resilient to unexpected conditions like that, even if they come up back to back. So I just want to reassure you, Ben, and call out right now that is our number one priority. We're not, getting past that issue. Absolutely front of mind. But Adam or Robert, if you want to say something about that specifically too, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Hopefully Adam doesn't mind too much. Again, I'm not here to be a cheerleader. This has been a rough, more than 72 hours, a rough 5 to 7 days for project teams in BIM 360, and I've heard it from our own internal users as well. But what I always try to remind people of sort of the scope, right? And Esther had up those statistics earlier, which I say to our teams internally, look, yeah, I get it. Nobody wants to be sitting there doing nothing, but the reality is, I think we have a really good IT department within Stantec. I think we have a really good digital practice team within Stantec, but we have our own internal systems, right? We've had issues with Revit Server. A file server can crash, can go down. And at the end of the day, Autodesk is far more motivated to resolve issues than even our own internal support structures are or can be, right? And it's not a knock on our internal teams. It's a pragmatic view on resource availability and the time it takes us to respond, right? If we have a Revit server issue internally, and it's actually a real significant issue of some kind, we've got a problem with a server that we don't know what's going on, it's probably going to take us 3 to 4 hours to finally resolve it, right? Between the time it takes to get reported, time for us to analyze the condition, try to determine what's going on, validate with the team that we fixed it. In my experience, the turnaround time of that is easily 2 to 3 hours, if not 4 hours, and that's just the reality of the situation. And I don't think we could go much faster. So, you know, I always try to put it in that perspective with our team is like, look, it's not just you sitting on your thumbs, it's everybody, and everybody's got deadlines for sure. It's not a great answer, but it's the best one I can offer too.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate it. So we are unfortunately at the top of the hour, so I do have to end our Q&A session for now, but not without saying a few important words. I've seen a lot of questions come in about, you know, where do I download the resources handout? Just a reminder, on these calls, there is usually a handout section in your console, and right now for this webinar, we have two handouts that you can download. One is the resources handout that will basically give you all the links that you need, especially that link to the Getting Started guide and the help pages. And so if you want to, you know, get started with those, save those, please do. And there's another link on there, which is the upcoming BIM 360 design webinar. So I just want to make a call out for all of those who had questions regarding, you know, whether we were going to do a technical deep dive. Again, this was a customer spotlight with Stantec, and we wanted to focus on Robert's collaboration practices and what Stantec's doing overall in the landscape. But for those of you who, you know, just want more clarity and more of the product vignettes and demos, Chris shared a link to a recording that took place a couple of weeks ago, but also please don't forget to sign up for the Technical Specialist Tuesdays. That's a great resource. You know, if you're a BIM manager or designer, someone that's going to be using BIM 360 Design every day, you can go on there, you can bring your questions, and there will be more of a bandwidth to answer questions on there. So I just wanted to, you know, do a quick shout out for that. And before some of you leave, as you are departing, I do want to ask you very quickly if you would be interested in speaking to an Autodesk representative regarding your BIM 360 design purchase option for those of you who haven't tried it before. So if you can, just answer that and let us know, that would be great. All right, that is all for now. Thank you so much, everyone. And I am going to, I'm going to say my one last thank you again to Robert and Adam for hosting this webinar. Thank you for walking us through that, the history of collaboration practices in Revit. All of that was really insightful for me to see, especially, and I'm sure to our attendees as well. Thank you for sharing your top tips and tricks. For everyone that's coming to AU, don't forget to go to Robert's class and also check out other BIM 360 design classes that are happening. I know Adam has a couple. So if you're going to be at AU, say hello. And thanks once again. This recording will be sent out to all those who signed up to attend. So look out for that in your inbox. Have a great rest of your day.